Let's talk about risky business. Wow. Just wow. Coming into this film, I really only knew about the one infinitely famous scene with Tom Cruise sliding in on his socks and singing the old time rock and roll. And I always thought Risky Business was just kind of one of those lighthearted teen sex comedies, something similar to, say, I don't know, maybe a John Hughes film or just a weaker version of that. I never really had a lot of interest in Risky Business. And when Emily suggested it just the other day, I was like, sure. I needed something to watch, and it just happened to be on HBO, so let's watch it. There was no, nor has there ever been real desire to watch Risky Business. It's just what happened to be on to watch. But I was absolutely blown away by this film. First of all, although I think Tom Cruise gets a lot of crap because he's given some performances that are not the best in the world, I think this performance is quite incredible. And I think part of it is, Tom Cruise is so young in this movie that he hasn't really been influenced by any sort of techniques or ways to kind of, I don't know, he's still human in a way. Like, not that he isn't human, but he's still young enough that he's naive and has a certain sense of innocence, and you believe in this innocence. And even when you first start watching the film, what's so incredible about it is the first 10 to 15 minutes about the film are pretty light-hearted, and it feels like just your normal teen sex comedy. There's that amazing scene at the beginning where he's talking about seeing that woman in the shower, and he's walking through this fog, and no matter how far he walks, he can't reach her. And I noticed, looking at it, that he's on this treadmill and the wall is actually moving, and it's an incredible scene, an incredible shot, and just the amount of effort put into this opening shot is amazing. And even though that, yeah, I noticed this visual effect, I was more admirable to the visual effect than even if I didn't notice the visual effect, I don't think that would have affected how amazing I thought it was and how ingenious it was, kind of putting him on this treadmill and him walking in this fog, trying to reach this woman and never really able. And then it cuts to 4 or 5 of them sitting around playing poker, just a bunch of boys talking about what teenage boys talk about, girls and sex and money. And there's this interesting thing that runs throughout it, which is about capitalism and materialism. And unlike, I would say, a John Hughes movie or so many films of the 80s, it's very critical of this world. It's very critical of, especially in the 80s, this very materialistic and capitalistic world. And for a film to be as famous as it is and anti-capitalist as it is kind of amazing. My friend Andrew often points out why he thinks Avatar is such a great film is because there aren't a lot of popular films that are anti-capitalist or anti-imperial or anti-colonial, although I would argue that Avatar is actually all of those things. It is actually an imperialist film, it is a colonialist film, it is a capitalist film, but regardless, this film, Risky Business, kind of proves that a film can have something to say, just like how I was talking about Da 5 Bloods was so concerned with having something to say that it didn't actually say something. This film actually has something to say, and the reason it works, and the same reason that is the Five Bloods didn't work, is because it's built on a story. It's based entirely on this really intriguing and kind of weird and quirky story, and these moments are really funny. And the way the humor hits is kind of strange. It doesn't hit the same way it does in, say, a Ferris Bueller or a Breakfast Club, or really so many of the 80s comedies. It doesn't have that kind of nice, clean, classy humor. It's something much darker. And honestly, the film reminds me a lot of the film Heathers. And Tom Cruise just gets entrapped in this world. I love how he's, he basically meets this call girl and then he kind of fumbles his way into a brothel. And the performances from everyone involved is so interesting, although it is, I don't know if this film could be made today simply because if you watch Risky Business, all of the call girls are of legal age, of course, 18, 19, 20 years old, maybe as old as 30 or 35. But some of the boys are boys, and even Tom Cruise is only supposed to be playing, obviously he's 18 for legal reasons, at least, I think. But he's only supposed to be, he's supposed to be playing a high school senior, so he's only supposed to be 17, maybe 18 years old, which is a little sketchy. But then you think of all the boys that he brings to the party. Some of them are as young as 12 years old, and it is creepy. And the only reason I think it works is because they are male. Because think about if you took a moment and you inverted that. Think about just for a moment. Think about their male prostitutes and they were 12, 13-year-old girls. That would be, it'd be rape, wouldn't it? And yet, because they are of the male sex, no one bats an eye. And even although I certainly felt uncomfortable. Because can a 12-year-old really make that choice? Kind of, sort of, maybe. Not really. But the film does have this sort of assumption that the male mind is just kind of obsessed with lust and this lustfulness, and this film is concerned a lot with to be lustful, what it means to have lust, and I'm truly fascinated by this film, and I'm kind of struggling to talk about this film because every single moment I'm just in love with. Let's talk a minute about that score, just all of the synths, and it is just such a wonderful score, and every single minute you hear that score, you are just in love with it, and the tone is set so well, and it's interesting. And I think this has a lot to do with its thoughts on materialism and capitalism and innocence. Is much like Tom Cruise, the viewer slowly loses their innocence. At the beginning of the film, you are lulled into this average, teen comedy. It's just Tom Cruise and his friends, and they drive it around. And they even do kind of the Ferris Bueller thing where, hey, drive the station wagon, and then he goes and drives the Porsche. And it just feels like this very, innocent and fun film, and then it gets a little bit darker when they call the call girl and ends up being a man, and then they call the real call girl Lana, and by this point you're probably 25-30 minutes into the film, and as a viewer, because the descent in the darkness has been so slow, has taken so long, when you really start getting to the really dark stuff, talking about a teenage female prostitute, talking about these very, poverty and these very serious and dark issues and rape and abuse and murder, you've almost been lulled into this experience where you can continue to buy into it because the descent is so slow that at no moment does it feel wrong. And I think that even listening to the score, if you listen to the score at the beginning, it's sort of upbeat, it's kind of fun, and then it just gets darker and darker. And of course, how can you not talk about that amazing scene when they're in the L train and Tom Cruise, or whatever his name is, Joel and Lana, and the Phil Collins song "In the Air Tonight" plays. Oh, it's probably, I will say, it will probably go down as one of my favorite moments in cinema. It's just a culmination of everything that's happened to that point. And even though there are these really strange and dark moments, there's still kind of these pockets of lightheartedness. Like I think of the L train scene when they're first on there, and there's something very dark about their lust, really. And yet the pocket of humor of the drunk man kind of gawking at them, and Tom Cruise, Joel, uncomfortable with it, and he's like slowly getting people off the train. Or when he goes to school and he's late, and she's about to write him about to fail him for his midterms, and it goes from like 1 to 10 really quickly, because he's like, no, please, please, I'm at a call girl, blah blah, in a car and all this. And then he grabs her by the collar and basically just threatens her. And in a lot of ways, that is a microcosm of the whole film. The film just feels very lighthearted and fun, and then these moments will just kind of hit you. And I mean, how do you not think of the scene where Joel is talking to the Princeton admissions, and there's this incredible line, which I'm going to butcher, but he's talking to the guy at Princeton, and the Princeton's like, look, you really haven't really done much, and this really isn't, this meeting really isn't going very well. And Tom Cruise goes, well, it looks like I'm going to the University of Illinois. And it just reeks of that kind of mantra, which his dad lines at the end by saying, what the heck? Sometimes just to say, what the heck. Of course, the real mantra is a little bit darker. But I have no real criticism of the film. I mean, of course, the age is a little uncomfortable. But even that is kind of pointing to this certainly growing lustfulness. And I think it's absolutely amazing, and I don't know if this was true in the 80s or not, that you could just call a hooker or a whore. I mean, you certainly, right, you couldn't do that today. You couldn't just go into your local newspaper and be like, oh yes, here are 27 hookers. I guess I don't know how easy or difficult it is to find sex workers, but apparently in the 80s it is just incredibly easy. They're just right there in the newspaper, and you just call them up, and that's absolutely, I mean, I completely buy into it. Maybe it's because I'm not from the 80s. Maybe it's because the 80s, I mean, that was 40 years ago now, so maybe I can buy into that. And there's one of the most fascinating thing about this film is, even though this film, again, is 37 years old, 38 years old, actually, it feels incredibly modern. It feels incredibly modern with what it has to say about modern sexuality, what it has to say about the loss of innocence, what it has to say about materialism and capitalism and our need for more. I mean, how do you not think of the scene at the end when Tom Cruise finally gets all of his stuff back, and the mom is not even a little bit bothered that they didn't go and pick them up, and yet she looks at the egg and there's just the tiniest crack in it, and she just goes off on this long tangent of how disappointed she is in him, how she can never trust him again, and blah 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 blah. And of course the dad kind of doesn't really care either way, and it's just this tiny crack, and Tom Cruise is like, well, maybe it was already there. And I mean, imagine being Tom Cruise, having lost literally everything and then got it all back. And then some, right? He got everything back, but still owes him like $300. And his mom is pissed off about the tiny crack in the egg, just showing really what it is that they care about. And one of the other fascinating, and perhaps one of the biggest buy-ins you really have to make with this film, is that it all takes place in like the span of a week. I remember at some point during the film I asked my wife, how long are his parents away? Because it feels like decades go by, but if you really like put down the days, it really is only about a week, which is kind of insane and amazing. And it works. I mean, it really shouldn't work, but it does, even though there's really short amount of time and so many things happen in this short amount of time. You can buy into it the same way you can buy into all the things happen in Ferris Bueller's Day Off or all these other films, and of course it has to work this way because his parents can't be gone forever and all these things, blah 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 blah. But I think the other part of it is it's about growth, and I think this film is a lot about adulthood, which is the strange thing about adulthood. And perhaps I'm not the best person to talk about adulthood, or perhaps I'm not even a good person to talk about adulthood, is that we think it's this sort of casual growth, one after another after another after another, and then you're an adult. All right, you go from kid to preteen to teen to emerging adulthood to middle age to old age. But what this film suggests, and I think what is so often true, is adulthood is most of the time nothing happens, and you live most of your life, and then you'll just have this moment, this sort of epiphany where you just change entirely, this short amount of time span. And that's exactly what's happening in this film. Who Tom Cruise is at the beginning of the film and who he is at the end of the film with those iconic sunglasses that he wears is an entirely different person. There's this amazing amount of growth in a short amount of time. And of course, every film, there's growth. That's kind of the point of the film. Again, it's where so many films seem to fail. And a film like Da 5 Bloods failed was there's really no growth in these characters, where Risky Business, every character has very distinct motives, goals, and growth. And I think it's interesting that at the end of the film, Lana and Joel are together. Because it seems very clear to me that she is the reason she conned him out of all of his stuff. Why else would they go have sex on the L train if not to get him out of the house so they could steal all of his stuff and then force him to buy it back? And yet, despite the fact that she steals everything from him, the sort of happy ending is her and him together. And even though it's not played the same way, say, the ending is in The Graduate, I can't help but think of that ending and think of the parallels to be made between these two films. And even though the score doesn't follow it, going out of this film, I felt happy, like it was a happy ending. But the more you think about it, the more you think this isn't a happy ending at all. This woman, Lana, has cheated Joel out of everything and is probably just going to continue to do that over and over again. This is certainly not a healthy relationship by any means. And it's interesting how Lana uses sex to control Joel, and in a lot of ways Joel, it really fights the patriarchy in this way, in the sense that Joel through a lot of the film doesn't have much power. He's constantly at the behest of Lana, and it is Lana that destroys the car, and you wonder. I think of that just the snippet, the tiny moment where Lana reaches into the car to grab a jacket or what have you, and she bumps into the gear shift, and it's like 2 seconds. It is such a short shot, and knowing it's so short, I knew from that moment until the car rolled down the hill, which was actually a significant amount of time, which I like. But from that moment until it rolls down the hill, I knew it was going to happen, right? I saw it there. I'd seen Ferris Bueller's Day Off. I know how these kind of things work. And looking back at it, part of me wonders, and I suppose I'd have to watch that scene again, but part of me wonders if that was intentional. Because if you bump into a gear shift, you're pretty aware that you bump into that gear shift. Because the rest of the film doesn't happen if the car doesn't go into Lake Michigan. Because she tried to turn Joel's place into a house earlier in the film, and he's like, no way, not gonna happen. But once the car goes into the lake, he changes his tune, he changes his mind. He's like, yeah, I gotta pay for this car, which is amazing that they even got it out of the water and that it only cost less than $8,000 in damages, since they only made $8,000, which it's kind of hard to figure out how much money cost. And I think Lana makes a good point, which one of the things I almost wish they went more into, but I know it probably wouldn't fit in the film, is Lana's life beforehand. Lana says as they're leaning on the Porsche, I really don't want to hear advice from someone leaning on their dad's $40,000 car. And it really puts things in perspective in a way that I feel like films like Ferris Bueller don't. The film just seems to be so much more aware of itself than so many films of its era. While there are so many films that talk about materialism, especially in the 80s, I think of American Psycho as really the only other film I can think of, which is a very violent film that poignantly recognizes just how ridiculous and absurd it is and how dark it can be and how powerful that is. And because of that, I'm going to give this film a 9 out of 10. It's honestly, while not my favorite film I've watched this year, it's one of the most enjoyable films I've watched in a really long time. And I think I would put it above a Ferris Bueller or, say, a Breakfast Club. Maybe it's not as fun or as lighthearted, but it has a lot more to say. And because it has a lot more to say, I think it's a better film, and I'm really glad I watched it. Will I ever watch it again? Probably not. I rarely ever watch a film more than once, but it's an experience that I was blown away by, and perhaps the fact that I came in with so low expectations is part of the reason I love it so much, because I expected almost nothing out of it, and I certainly got a lot more than nothing. But overall, it was a really great experience.